And good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CEEC Policy Forum on the Transatlantic Security in Peril, Ukraine at War. For those of you who are not familiar with the CEEC, it stands for the Central and Eastern Europe Coalition. Established in 1994, it comprises of 18 national organizations representing Americans of Central and East European descent. We have Armenian, Belarusian, Bulgarian, Czech, Estonian, Georgian, Hungarian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Polish, Romanian, Slovak, and Ukrainian diasporas with strong ties with these countries. Our members not only have a great deal of insights into each country, but also have a vested interest in supporting peace and security in Central East Europe and the US. The coalition serves as a liaison between these organizations, and together we coordinate our advocacy efforts with respect to the US policy that affects the countries of this region. My name is Veronika Metonice, and I am president of the Georgian Association in the US, which is the oldest Georgian diaspora organization in this country. And in fact, we were celebrating 90th anniversary this year. And we're, for past 20-some years, we've been proud members of the CEEC. We do believe that together we can achieve a lot of good things. We've called attention to many important issues such as NATO enlargement, Russian aggression towards its neighbors, US assistance programs for the region. Today we are discussing the transatlantic security challenges in light of the Russia's war in Ukraine. So obviously, Ukraine has been the focus of our attention for past several months. Last month, we've been talking about its impact on the Black Sea. Today, we will be discussing more broader issues with the transatlantic security. We have a great panel put together by our members. I'm going to set the stage for Michael Savkiv, who will be the moderator of this discussion, and he will represent our panelists in a little bit. Michael is a relentless advocate for Ukraine, and he's a former president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Since 1996, he has served as director of the CEEC Washington, D.C. Bureau, Ukrainian National Information Service, the Ukrainian Community Advocacy Arm in Washington, D.C. And Michael is a great moderator. He's been moderating most of our policy forums, especially since the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Michael is also chairman of the U.S. Committee for Ukraine Holodomor Genocide Awareness, and was instrumental in the establishment of the Ukrainian Genocide Memorial in Washington, D.C. Michael will introduce all our panelists in a second, but before that, I just like to go over some housekeeping issues, and say that this webinar is being recorded, and you can access it after 1:30 at ceecadvocacy.org. And we also ask you to ask questions in the Q&A part of this webinar. We will be answering them as we will be answering them at the end of the panelist discussion. And we encourage you to ask more questions because this will be the best part to use our panelists. They have great insights into this war. They have a lot of fresh information, so please feel free to ask all the questions. And Michael, please take away.
Veronica, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Veronica, thank you for truly that very generous introduction. And it's an honor to moderate once again the Central and East European Coalition Policy Forum Series. The topic of today's discussion is going to be the Transatlantic Security in Peril, ? Ukraine at War, in which we'll explore the current political, the economic, the military context of the war in Ukraine, with, of course, an emphasis on the effects on transatlantic security and the democracies throughout the world. So the Central and East European Coalition has assembled two stellar experts who will provide their unique perspective and analysis of the policies and the mindset of the aggressor state and the economic impacts of global retribution for Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine. But given the context of current dramatic events in the region and the developments with our allies on the European continent, we're looking at, obviously, the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine 8 months ago, beginning on February 24th of 2022. The most recent use of Iranian-made drones in Ukraine. The explosion of the NS1 and NS2 pipelines in the Baltic Sea. The G7, the EU, and NATO summits that were held earlier this summer, as well as the upcoming G20 summit in 2 weeks in Indonesia. And the big question there is, will they or won't they meet in sidebar discussions, that being President Biden, as well as the authoritarian leader of the Russian Federation. The buildup of Russia's militarization of the Crimean Peninsula and in the Black Sea region, the extent of expanding economic sanctions, Ruski Mir, Russia World, and therefore we will hear from our panelists and seek their counsel, their analysis, their policy recommendations for a united transatlantic policy towards Ukraine, one that advances our interests and the collective security of our allies. Now we'll hear from our experts, but prior to our panelists, as Veronica had mentioned, I just want to clarify one piece of housekeeping items here to all of our audience members. If there are any questions to the experts, they are to be submitted in the Q&A function down below. I will be reviewing the questions as well as my colleague Veronica from the Central and East European Coalition, and we'll pose them and announce them to the panelists after their presentations. And now to our panelists. I will commence with short bios, starting ladies first with Dr. Agnia Grigas, followed by Paul Massaro. Dr. Agnia Grigas is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council working on energy and geopolitical economy. She is the author of 3 acclaimed books, The New Geopolitics of Natural Gas, Beyond Crimea, the New Russian Empire, and The Politics of Energy and Memory Between the Baltic States and Russia. She has testified for the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources on American LNG exports to Europe. Dr. Grigas was an energy and FDI foreign direct investment advisor to the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She started her career as a financial analyst at JP Morgan and subsequently advised on emerging markets for Eurasia Group, Barclays Bank, and other Fortune 100 companies. Mr. Paul Massaro is a senior policy advisor for counter-corruption and sanctions. Paul's work has advanced the recognition of corruption as a national security threat. He has been described in the media as one of America's foremost corruption experts and, quote, an endless source of democratic ingenuity. He has worked on over 13 pieces of counter-corruption legislation and facilitated the founding of the Congressional Caucus Against Foreign Corruption and Kleptocracy and the Interparliamentary Agency Alliance Against Kleptocracy. Paul also covers German-speaking Europe and East Asia. Paul is regularly quoted and published by major media outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and Foreign Policy, and he speaks frequently on panels, such as this one, podcasts and broadcasts about corruption, sanctions, European security policy, etc. His work is featured in Casey Michel's book, American Kleptocracy, How the U.S. Created the World's Greatest Money Laundering Scheme in History. So with that, again, ladies first, look forward to an opportunity for Dr. Grigas and for Paul to present their opening remarks of about 10 to 15 minutes, followed by a vigorous round of questions and answers. The floor is yours, Dr. Grigas, please.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Today, I'm going to speak with you as we're entering potentially a very difficult winter, as the war has been dragging on for 8 months. Really, there are questions and concerns about transatlantic unity, transatlantic security overall. So today, I want to actually take a step back and re-examine again what are Russia's aims, what Russia has been doing in Ukraine, not just the past 8 months, not just the past 8 years, but what have been its imperial ambitions, frankly, in the broader Central and Eastern European region. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to share a presentation or some slides, which essentially we're going to share a framework I developed in my second book, Beyond Crimea, The New Russian Empire. You know, I wrote this book I started writing this book right around the time of Crimea's occupation, and this was published in 2016 from Yale. So, but in some ways, you know, a lot of things have changed, but in some ways, little has changed because, again, the underlying motives and the methods remain the same. So we are at 8 months of war right now already. What have been the implications already for the public of Ukraine? And we have some 14 million refugees. We have counts of some 6,000 civilian casualties, though quite likely that number is significantly higher. On the Russian side, we have at least 60,000 troops dead. We have at least 1 million that have fled in recent months, fleeing mobilization, and overall the crackdown and this kind of return back to Stalinist times in Russia. But at the same time, we know that this has been indeed 8 years of war since February 2014, since this first effort to grab land in Ukraine. For whatever reason, I still find that both Crimea's annexation and the war, the invasion this year has come as a shock to many. Probably not this community that has probably their experiences of themselves, their parents, their grandparents. But it still, for whatever reason, has come as a shock for a lot of the policy establishment and foreign policy commentators, a lot of the talking heads on TV. Frankly, if we look at that framework, if we look at Russia's aims and methods that it has been pursuing, well, we can say at least during Putin's regime, if we go back to during the Soviet era, if frankly we go back to the methods of the Russian Empire, we really see a lot of policy continuity. So, you know, for me, this was never a shock. I can tell you my grandmother in her kitchen could have explained a lot of these dynamics, and not any worse than a lot of the talking heads in Washington, D.C. But, you know, here we go. I'm gonna take you through some terminology and some jargon that my grandmother wouldn't have used for this. So, in my book, I proposed essentially that one way we can look at Russia's foreign policy is through what I call a 7-stage re-imperialization trajectory. I can say I got some flack when the book came out in 2016 that I was being a little bit, maybe too dramatic, that annexation, wasn't going to be something in the cards, that Crimea was unique, a unique case. But again, of course, over the last 8 years, we've just seen, a more and more aggressive Russian policy, and in fact, occupation of territories in Ukraine. So really, the pretext for this expansionism has been the so-called compatriots. What are these compatriots? These are Russia has defined them in a wide variety of ways over the last 20 years of their policy, but in the most basic terms, these are Russian speakers who reside outside the Russian Federation. So this trajectory really is centers around Russian soft power, progresses to humanitarian policies, compatriot policies, passportization, handing out of Russian passports in the near abroad countries, information warfare, and as well cyber warfare, and then calls for protection and annexation, final annexation, like we've seen in the case of Crimea and last month, again in eastern Ukraine. So this is a map from my book that essentially in gray, in these gray zones, you can see that I've highlighted in here and here, what would be areas with significant Russian-speaking populations. And these have been the targets of Moscow's so-called Russian compatriot policy that the Kremlin has repeatedly, now has sought out to so-called protect. If we look at, again, so this is where would be Russian-speaking populations. And if we look at the map of how the conflict has shifted in Ukraine, we kind of see a parallel, an echo of that. Of course, the invasion with Ukraine being surrounded, but an effort to try to secure and occupy southeastern Ukraine, essentially, again, where Russia can claim these so-called Russian speakers reside, where so-called compatriots. So at the time, I was doing interviews with inhabitants, with these Russian speakers in Odessa. And I had selected Odessa in particularly as the third largest Ukrainian city and also largely a Russian-speaking city. And it's interesting for me to think, already the things these individuals were saying back in 2014 and thinking how their lives have evolved since then. Where are they now in terms of are they refugees? Have they been injured? Are they in hiding? How has their life turned out? So this was Yelena, and she was a recent university graduate from Odessa. She was living in Kiev for work at the time already, and she was from a family. She was born and raised in Odessa in a Ukrainian family, but it was always, they always spoke Russian at home. And she was explaining, look, here everyone speaks Russian, but we're not Russian. We are Russian-speaking Ukrainians and patriots of our country. And probably, I wish Putin would have maybe read that sentence. Maybe he wouldn't have been so confused, right? Or, whether he's going to be greeted with his tanks are going to be greeted with flowers in those Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, right? And here she goes on, based on my experience, it's a myth that Russian speakers are discriminated against, pressured, or intimidated anywhere in Ukraine, including Western-speaking Ukrainian territories. And again, a very already telling sentence. I wonder from whom Russia is going to protect us, from ourselves. What is happening in our country should be decided from within, and we do not need outside help. So, and here's another young woman. I have three of them that I wanted to highlight. So she was a young marketing professional, and at the time she spoke some English. She was hoping to travel to America one day, it's interesting, actually. In fact, right now we have a Ukrainian refugee living in our home who is also from Odessa. So it's, the parallels for me and, how much these past 8 years, how much of it has unraveled for the population of Ukraine. So, again, she highlighted she has no grievances as a Russian speaker in Ukraine. And she goes on to say, in a democratic society, everyone has the freedom and the right to speak the language of their choice. We don't have fascism or totalitarianism. Nobody dictates the language we speak here, and certainly not in my region. Russia should turn its attention to its own domestic problems and not to the domestic problems of a neighboring country. And finally, Margarita, who was a student of marine logistics at the time in Odessa University, and she dreamt of working in merchant marines. She had Russian roots on her paternal side, and she went on to say, look, Russia and Ukraine are two separate countries. I have never lived in and will never live in Russia. She certainly didn't think Russian speakers needed any sort of protection. And again, reiterating, like many others I interviewed, that all problems can be solved from the borders of our own country. So I'm going to take a look a little bit at Russia's foreign policy trajectory step by step. And again, when we discuss what we can do and how we can influence policy, it's very important that we consider these factors, again, because these are the arenas that Russia is playing with. So, one is soft power, but, I can say Russian soft power is a little bit different than when we think of, kind of our own American soft power. Really, it's a power of coercion, this kind of, much harder soft power than we would think of. But really, its efforts is to try to use the linguistic, cultural, religious, and economic ties as they try to appeal to the 35 million members of the Russian world. Again, Ruski Mir. And, this term, Ruski Mir, probably for those of you who speak Russian, maybe quite a number of you, again, Russian world, or the term also Mir can mean both world and peace. Now, of course, it's ironic when Ukrainians state, oh, the Russian Mir has come, not Russian peace, but certainly Russian war. And there are a lot of concerns also, as I'm coming back here, that this Ruski Mir, why do we have some concerns in countries like Georgia about, and Kazakhstan and so on, about the mass Russian emigration into these neighboring countries now as Russians are fleeing mobilization? There are concerns, again, that with the sizable presence of Russian speakers or ethnic Russians or Russian citizens in their countries, that they could be potential future targets as well for Russian meddling. So that's a very real, honestly, very real concern. It has nothing to do with, liking or disliking the Russians or those who are fleeing mobilization. And another element here is the 150 million members of the Russian Orthodox Church, with here Patriarch Peril, who has really served as a mouthpiece for the Kremlin throughout the region. And I put up a little anecdote, well, particularly the joke also that now going around in the neighboring countries of Russia, such as northern Kazakhstan, for example. So where people say, well, I'm afraid to speak Russian, those that were traditionally Russian speakers, in case Putin thinks that he will need to liberate me. So I think while this is also the basis for, kind of the initial steps of Russian influence and meddling in the near abroad, at the same time, I think this soft power is really falling apart for Russia since the invasion. A second element is so-called humanitarian policies on the Russian side. And we see that again in the case of this year, where deportations of Ukrainian families or children to Russia are being presented as, in fact, humanitarian policies. I won't touch on that too much for the sake of time. And if we look at compatriot policies overall, I detailed this extensively in my book because, in fact, this has been about 20 years of policies, laws, foreign policy principles that have been developed under Vladimir Putin's regime, but frankly, that go back to the 90s, that go back, of course, even echo the policies of Tsarist Russia. So this map now takes a bigger picture of the regions where Russian speakers reside, and we see again northern Kazakhstan, parts of Kyrgyzstan, an element here in northern Georgia, although in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, many indeed were not Russian speakers before Putin decided to liberate them, an area in Armenia around the Russian military base. Now, of course, Belarus, and again, parts of Estonia, Latvia. Another element which is happening actually under our eyes right now is this passportization. So essentially handing out Russian passports to inhabitants of newly occupied territories, such as in Kherson. Now, Russia used to do that consistently since the 2000s. They were handing out Russian passports to the inhabitants of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, to later try to justify their claims that not only they're going to protect Russian compatriots, because again, that's a nebulous term, but really they're going to protect Russian now citizens who reside in these neighboring countries. This tactic was also done in Crimea before 2014. there were efforts to spread as many Russian passports as they could before the actual occupation in 2014. And again, even the data I have already between 2000 and 2009, there were some 3 million people in the former Soviet Union who had acquired Russian passports. So, in a way, this passportization is an effort to, you're changing, before you even bring your armies in, you're changing the facts on the ground, and you're changing the citizenships of the people in question, sometimes with bribes, sometimes forcefully, and other methods. Now, another element is information warfare and cyber warfare. I really hope that, as a community that understand Russia's foreign policy and aims better, we can really advocate for the banning of RT and Sputnik as widely as possible. Really, this is a question, this propaganda, Russian propaganda, goes through state-controlled media outlets that are both targeting the domestic audience and the international audience. And in addition to that, of course, we have cyber warfare, we have the troll factories, that are well documented already, working in St. Petersburg and Moscow and beyond. So the next step is calls for protection. Now, these calls typically are originating more from the Kremlin than the actual people in question. This is an image from Russian tanks arriving into Georgia. But it's an effort to try to institutionalize this protection for the Russian speakers or any other, frankly, ethnic groups, as in the case of Georgia, like the South Ossetians or Abkhazians, outside of the borders of the Russian Federation. And the final step, annexation. Well, we see the Putin rally last month when he announced he's taking into the Russian Federation Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And of course, already the precedent for that in 2014. So I've asked you to take a little bit maybe of a historical look and a broader look at this framework and what is happening beyond just Ukraine, what is happening in Russia's near abroad and the longevity of these policies. And I would also like you to consider even a broader context for this. That we're truly, truly in a global geopolitical contest between democratic and authoritarian states, and that unity for us as members of democratic societies is absolutely crucial, and it is absolutely crucial to our own future security in the Transatlantic Alliance. Frankly, I think we've seen over the years, this is not just a question for Russia's near abroad, not just a question for Ukraine, that we cannot, Western societies cannot hide from these ambitions of authoritarian states. We've seen, again, Russian meddling in every single, I would say, significant election that has taken place in Western Europe over the past decade. And of course, we've had our own experiences here in the United States. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Grigas, that was fascinating, at least for me. I know I took a lot of notes, so I hope those in the audience took notes as well. Please don't forget to put your questions to the panelists in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. And with that, no further ado, Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And I actually think Dr. Grigas left me with a really nice segue, because I think she's absolutely right. I think the kind of topic I want to discuss is sort of what's happened in the West and sort of the policy of democracies. And I think you're exactly right, Dr. Grigas, that we find ourselves in a new era. The February 24th is effectively, for me, and I think for many people I work with, the end of the post-Cold War era. It's the end of illusions, I hope, although many people continue to cling to those illusions that we can have supply chains and financial relationships and so on and so forth with authoritarian regimes who will weaponize them and weaponize everything into malign influence in democracies. And we'd been warning about this, at the Helsinki Commission, and compatriots of mine and others that have been working in this space have been warning about this for well over a decade now. And I'll say, it's really wonderful to speak with you all, because of course, had we listened to the Baltic states and the Ukrainians and the Polish and the Finns and so on and so forth just a little bit earlier, we may have been able to deter this war, but we didn't. And I guess that's really what it comes down to for me. Those who know my work know that I've spent a lot of time pushing for the recognition of corruption as a national security threat. Something that we succeeded at, actually. The year before the full-scale invasion, the president finally recognized corruption as a core national security interest of the United States in December 2021, just months before the full-scale invasion. The first ever U.S. strategy on countering corruption was published, which is just an enormous, accomplishment. And then prior to all of this, of course, Congress led the way with the establishment of the Caucus Against Foreign Corruption and Kleptocracy. And in any case, we had been trying so hard to help the West recognize this, that all of what Dr. Grigas was saying, that, they were pushing this corruption to our systems via malign finance, via misinformation, and so on and so forth, to ensure that the many different warning signs of this, and many went way beyond warning signs, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the abuse of Interpol over and over and over again, assassinations in the UK, assassinations in Berlin, possible assassinations in Washington, election interference all over the place. I mean, it's extraordinary what we missed, and we didn't so much miss it as decide it wasn't important enough to sacrifice the economic and financial relationships that we had with Russia and that we have with China. So it's very wise, again, Dr. Grigas, to point out that this is a global geopolitical competition, that China is supporting Russia, and I think there is still some kind of erroneous make-believe notion that China may play some role as some kind of negotiator. I mean, that's not real. And we need to recognize that in the post-February 24th world, this split between autocracy, an autocratic world, and democratic world has happened. And I guess I also want to recognize that because of our failure, because of the failure of deterrence against Russia, this invasion happened, and then we all kind of assumed that this would lead to this 3-day conquest of Ukraine, and we would have been ready to accept that. And we were actually ready to lose. I mean, the United States went to President Zelensky and said, we're ready to get you out of here. At which point, President Zelensky said, no, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition, which is, again, just kind of showing to us, what it means to fight and stand for the values that we claim to believe in. And we really needed that. And I think everything that followed, the sanctions that followed, the arms that followed, everything that followed was a product of this notion that, oh my God, Ukraine is actually going to stand and fight, and has stood and fought, and has showed us all how it's done. And in fact, probably thwarted an invasion of Taiwan, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which very likely would have followed the conquest of Ukraine. A testing of NATO would have followed the conquest of Ukraine. We may have had to, then follow through with our Article 5 commitments and so on and so forth. And we would be in a world war. So, I mean, something that I've said, and I very much believe, is Ukraine has already prevented a world war. And the faster Ukraine wins this war, the more likely we are to not end up in a world war. So long as this goes on, the risk remains. So we have pushed very, very strongly to get Ukraine what it needs to enhance sanctions and so on and so forth. So I guess I want to say a word to where we are on sanctions, since that's sanctions and corruption, since that's really what I work on. And we can talk about everything else, but I think that sanctions are of interest in what I've been asked to speak about. So the sanctioned response to this started very, very, very weak when there was the threat of invasion. The failure to sanction anyone prior to the invasion was a huge problem. I mean, there were a number of problems with the failure of deterrence, including various statements of, oh, well, we definitely won't put troops in Ukraine. And so, I mean, just like constant, signaling of what we wouldn't do to protect Ukraine, which was a problem. After the Ukrainians demonstrated their incredible capability and the defense of Kiev, the sanctions response was very strong, actually, for a couple of weeks, particularly the sanctions on oligarchs, which we've been pushing for the longest time. The various task forces that have been formed now. There's the Klepto Capture Task Force in the US, the Kleptocracy Office in the UK, Freeze and Seize Task Force in the EU. They're all united by this Russian elites, oligarchs, elites, proxies, and oligarchs, the repo task force of all these guys together, who have recently, made some progress. I mean, it's one problem is that this is long progress. It's hard to go after these guys. It really is. But there was the indictment of Deripaska, the initial seizure of all these yachts and penthouses and so on and so forth, although nothing has been forfeited yet. And we can go into maybe in question and answer, maybe later, whatever you like, Michael, talk about getting some of that money to Ukraine, which is another thing that I work on. But with regard to the sanctions, one of the great innovations and one of the things that I think we've only ever really used on Iran before, but we used on Russia, was the freezing of reserves, which was really exciting because there was this fear of Putin's war chest for the longest time, that he could inject this money back into the economy, thereby preventing sanctions from doing damage. But we just froze it. We just froze 600 billion in reserves in the European Central Bank and in the New York Federal Reserve. And that money's just sitting there. One of the big discussions now is, can we then confiscate that money? We've done this once before, to my knowledge, with regard to Afghanistan, where we took the Afghan sovereign assets and then tried to push them back in for humanitarian aid, although they ended up, I think, paying for 9/11 victims rather. But there's a whole discussion around this now that's really exciting, because one of the things is, I mean, overall we spent about 60 billion on assistance to Ukraine, only about like 20 billion of which is really actually assistance to Ukraine. A lot of this is fortifications for NATO and so on and so forth. So 300 billion is a lot. And I mean, 600 billion is a whole lot. And that wouldn't be any taxpayer money. I mean, we could just take Russia and make Russia pay. And that's not even counting the Russian oligarch assets. Now, the big failure of sanctions, the really major failure, has been in oil and gas. Obviously, gas, the European Union, Germany in particular, kept purchasing gas up until kind of the bitter end, when it was giving $1 billion euros a day to Russia, and Russia's war chest is now really significant thanks to that. Now, this is since stopped for the large part because Russia's kind of decided that they're going to, pursue the strategy of trying to freeze Europe out this winter, and they blew up. I mean, it appears who did this? They blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and major parts of Nord Stream pipeline. They've been trying to push the Germans into breaking the sanctions regime, and in some cases have succeeded. In particular in this very interesting turbine case where they got the Americans to put pressure on the Canadians to violate sanctions, to give it back to Germany, which then tried to give it back to Russia, at which point Russia said, oh, well, we don't actually need the turbine. It was a very interesting set of circumstances where Russia just once again wanted to prove that the West was weak and the West would violate its own sanctions regime. Now there's this oil cap in place, and I know this is something else that, Dr. Grigas pays attention to, but which Saudi Arabia then promptly broke through cutting the oil supply. I mean, it's really a fascinating set of dynamics, but it's been very disastrous ultimately, because oil and gas has effectively, enabled Russia to reduce the damage that would otherwise have been imposed by these sanctions, because that's the goal of our sanctions now, right? I mean, it's the goal of the military assistance too. We've gone beyond behavioral change, right? There's theories behind sanctions, and we often talk about sanctions in terms of, oh, we're changing Putin's behavior. We're not changing Putin's behavior anymore. We don't, I mean, what we're trying to do with sanctions is reduce the capacity of Russia to kill Ukrainians. that's basically what it amounts to at this point. We are trying to reduce the capacity of the Russian war machine, which is fundamentally different than the way we've looked at sanctions in the past. And in all honesty, it's the way that I've always kind of seen sanctions. I mean, when we think about sanctions on Cuba, Iran, North Korea, so on and so forth, people often argue that these sanctions have failed. I don't believe they've failed. I believe they've reduced the capacity of these states to do damage throughout the world. Our great mistake, kind of to bring this all full circle to the point of democracies and autocracies, was the integration of Russia, was the integration of China, was this, greedy, ignorant belief that through economic integration, we could democratize these places, when in fact, democracy does not move in that order. It does not work like that. It is a struggle every day to defend democracy. And that's something that we are recognizing again now. So, there's many people that want to, there's many different forces that want to find a way to kind of return to normal, particularly in light of, the incredible Ukrainian counteroffensives. There's kind of, okay, well, Ukraine's defended itself now, and, we can do these negotiations or give some part of, that's obviously ridiculous and would only lead to the renewal of hostilities. I mean, our position has been, complete Ukrainian victory, the return to 1991 sovereign borders, and the isolation of Russia for as long as it takes, and the support of Ukraine for as long as it takes, until this war is won, which is the only thing in the long term that will deter Russia and deter China and deter dictators generally. So I guess I'll leave it there, and we can get into all sorts of other questions around, money and sanctions and all that good stuff.
Paul, Dr. Grigas, thank you very much for excellent presentations. Frankly speaking, I've taken a lot of notes, and I have a feeling our audience members as well have taken a lot of notes, because I see lots of questions already that are coming into the Q&A function below. But as moderator, I'd like to kind of start the discussion with kind of combining both of your thoughts in phrasing the question, or phrasing or looking forward to where do we go from here. I'm looking at what Dr. Grigas had mentioned in terms of re-imperialization. I think these terms are absolutely necessary to comprehend. We need to understand what it means, but we also have to understand what does that signify, or what does that prove for the future. One of the things in terms of our policy forums that we've been having in the past several months, especially since the war in Ukraine, is the term decolonization has actually started to be used quite often now. Paul had mentioned this, that if American policy experts, Dr. Grigas, you mentioned, if American policy experts, administration officials had listened to your grandmother or had listened to us, we'd be in a totally different world right now. How do we not, to put it bluntly and to put it very succinctly, how do we not therefore repeat the mistakes of the past in moving forward? We already know that sanctions work, and not necessarily always to the best of the abilities, though. And I'll give you a prime example. Prime example for me, I was quite shocked that the United States government, after the four oblasts, the four regions in Ukraine were illegally annexed by the Russian Federation several weeks ago, immediately the State Department issued its sanctions on 100 members of the Russian Duma. Well, frankly speaking, I would have thought that on February 25th of 2022, those 100 members of the Russian Duma would have been sanctioned. I would have thought as well that the chairperson of the National Bank of Russia would have been sanctioned on February 25th of 2022, not on September, whatever date that it was. So how do we, knowing everything that we know about the past 8 months in Ukraine, knowing everything that we know in the past 8 years of Ukraine, and knowing everything that we know about the past several centuries of Russian imperialism, how do we not repeat those mistakes in the future? I'll leave it open-ended. I'll start with with Agnia, and then move over to Paul. Please, Dr. Grigas.
It's a very difficult question because, in fact, we do know and we have learned these lessons, but I think there are still a lot of individuals in the foreign policy establishment and leadership positions that don't. And I think in some ways, it's also, if we can compare, let's say, again, autocratic versus democratic systems, it's somewhat of a weakness in our democratic systems that we don't have that continuity. With election cycles, with our own domestic great political divides and division that we're experiencing today in this country. And even if we look back, we've seen almost, so many past American presidents coming into office saying that they will improve somehow relations with Russia, that somehow this will be different. You can go back to, George W., who, kind of thought he had that connection when these are cliches now, looked into the eyes of Vladimir Putin and so on. We had Hillary Clinton when she had the reset button. We had President Trump when he came in. Again, somehow he thought, his personal skills will improve this relationship. So I think probably we're maybe for the first time with Biden, we have a leader in the White House who had already experienced, who has been tried in some ways from his previous experience as vice president, having this, very already the realities of that relationship with Russia without probably coming in with hopes to improve this. But, again, I feel like we keep, falling, I don't know what's the expression, stepping on the same something twice or falling in the same ditch endless times. I think it's really the realization that's necessary that this is something also beyond some unique circumstances, whether it's Crimea, whether it's some unique circumstances as Russia tries to present it in Georgia, or let's say in the case of Moldova, Transnistria, that this truly is a global geopolitical contest, again, between democratic states and authoritarian states, autocratic states. And we can't assume that somehow we can just do business as usual, trade as usual, and just think about, I don't know, profits and so on, without looking at that broader picture and the true intents of countries to frankly weaken us, weaken the United States, weaken our society, divide us further.
So
Well,
let me try to express something here. So I actually don't lay the blame with the elected politicians. And I think for the most part, actually, our electoral system gets, the best of American foreign policy is generally comes out of the elected politicians. I mean, when you look at like the human rights, anti-corruption, all that stuff generally comes out of Congress. The problem is really more the great power politics expert community that in sort of the Russianist community that generally sort of looks at global politics and sees kind of these empires that have to do business together because it's all about who's strong, and the kind of Thucydides, like the strong do what they can and the weak do as they must, and that's kind of where they live, and that's why we keep hitting the same problems, because we've got this kind of path dependency in our policy. When we look at Russia, we don't really see this imperial empire that we see the USSR, we see Moscow, so many of what the people that are advising and that are writing the memos and that are writing the pieces, in DC, and that have kind of the ear of the people that have the ear of the president and so on and so forth. These individuals have listened to Valdai, Moscow. They've been when they look east, they see Moscow. When Berlin looks east, they see Moscow, right? I mean, these kind of groups, these countries in between, these Poles and these Ukrainians and these Balts, they just screw it up for everybody. Why can't they just, keep to themselves and, sort of do what they're told by the great powers? And why do they insist on sovereignty and what, it's like, so this needs to change. And that's why the decolonial perspective is so important, because it challenges the overarching kind of IR perspective of great power politics. It effectively says, No, you need to listen to the voices within Russia that make up the empire. You need to view Russia as the Russian Empire, essentially, as the long fall of the Russian Empire. 100 years, like 100 years later, the Bolsheviks, keep it going for a little while. They embrace fascism and so on and so forth. And they eventually, Russia never has its kind of Germany moment where democracy is shoved down its throat like we did with Germany. Russia has done zilch, nothing to come to terms with the past. The many, many, many different evils that Russia has done to its neighbors and to its ethnic minorities and to its, and to white Russians and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's, this Russian state is utterly unapologetic. It's totally imperial. And that's why this kind of decolonial perspective is so new. It's like, okay, wait, let's listen to, the people, the peoples within Russia, the captive nations within Russia. Let's listen to those peoples who have been seen as Russian colonies, like the Baltic states, like the Ukrainians, like the Poles. Let's listen to their experience and understand it from their perspective. And then when you do that, you're like, oh, this is actually how Russia operates. And you start getting a much clearer perspective and a much more real perspective on how Russia operates rather than listening to kind of Moscow. So, I mean, it's tough. It's hard to walk away from that. And you have to retrain the entire expert community, basically, that does the advising in DC. But we're really doing our best. I think the new generation of experts will not. I mean, it's just the facts on the ground have fundamentally changed, right? I mean, like, how can you see Russia as a great power after this? I mean, they've effectively been defeated by Ukraine. So, I mean, like, how can you see them as great Russia after this anyway, just in pure power politics terms?
To that extent, this is the fight of democracy versus authoritarianism. Obviously, the examples of everybody throughout the world of authoritarian governments and autocrats looking at what's happening in Ukraine and deciding on their grand chessboard what's our next particular move. In our prior and previous policy forums, we've had experts that actually have been very blunt. They've said that Russia must be defeated in Ukraine. This is not just appeasement for Russia, that we as the Western world now, as the global community of democracies, somehow will come to some offset, to some deal with Russia. And we can't be intimidated by Russia anymore. Paul, to your point, exactly to your point. But how do we take it, Paul, this may be specifically to you in terms of sanctions. We've known that sanctions have been effective, but not necessarily because the war obviously is continuing 8 months later. There's a question that's been posed in terms of increased trade that Russia has with India and with Brazil. Hasn't that necessarily offset all of the Western democracies' sanctions against the Russian war machine?
So it really hasn't offset it. I mean, to replace Europe as a market for Russia is extremely difficult. I mean, this was always kind of the theory, was like, wow, we actually have a lot of leverage over these guys. We should recognize that we have leverage, that they rely on us as we rely on them. I mean, I think it's just more embarrassing for India and Brazil that they're unable to recognize exactly what we're talking about here, that this is a global conflict between democracies and autocracies. There's nothing really more embarrassing than kind of these countries that have a decolonial perspective. Like, I mean, India's politics is just shot through with a decolonial perspective, and yet they can't seem to grasp that Russia is an empire and a colonial state. And this is a large part because of Russian obfuscation and the incredible trick over decades of the USSR disguising itself and using the language of decolonization in order to pursue empire. I mean, really, hiding the Russian Empire in communism has got to be one of the great kind of like tricks of history, right? I mean, like it has fooled and continues to fool numerous African nations, India, Brazil, so on and so on. And this notion that to oppose kind of American-led capitalism is to be pro-Russia is just unbelievable and demonstrates an extremely deep ignorance. But again, a mentality that's very much shaped in the Cold War, right? And the fact that this Cold War mentality has not left Brazil, has not left India, and has not left DC. And that's why we're still, I mean, we're struggling to do the right thing in DC, and some of us are, but I mean, it really is a struggle. I mean, Ukraine still doesn't have ATACMS, you know, I mean, Ukraine still, like, we're still constantly hand-wringing about escalation and all this other stuff that just like doesn't make sense in the current context, you know? So I mean, we all are struggling with the legacy of the Cold War. I mean, in one sense, no one more so than Russia, right? What, you know, I mean, if any single country lives with the legacy of the Cold War, it's Russia that's trying to rebuild the empire, you know? So, you know, yeah, I'll leave it there.
I'll follow up with that specifically
Please.
on, you know, energy and Russia and India. So indeed, as Paul said, it's very difficult for Russia to immediately replace the European market. I mean, frankly, the Europeans have been buying the largest volumes and paying the highest prices, you know, for decades. And really that dependency goes back to the Cold War era, including with all the infrastructure that is there. So Russia itself has sought to pivot towards the Asian markets for now. You know, this has been in their works, in their, you know, policy agenda for maybe 10, 15 years. But the fact is they don't have sufficient infrastructure to do that. What has helped them just for now, while they haven't been able to offset the volumes, the very high price environment has, you know, made it essentially, even when they're selling lower volumes, they're making more money than they did, you know, before the war. So that's a major issue, the very high oil and gas price environment right now, which I would like to see, you know, frankly, more action on the US side. The United States is now the largest producer of oil and gas in the world. It's an energy superpower. And frankly, I mean, I wrote about this, spoke about this. This is really time to flex these muscles for the United States. Certainly renewables are the future, but the fossil fuel muscle is here today, and it should be flexed in this time of crisis. When we look at India specifically, you know, for me, it's a little, you know, India is kind of a democracy, right, in name and in practice. But again, maybe some of the leanings of this current government, some of those political relationships that had been established between Delhi and, you know, Moscow. And I think India remains this kind of major swing state in this current geopolitical contest. So for me, it's very interesting to, you know, I think it's very strategically important which way India is going to turn in the end. And I think that's also a relationship that's very important for Washington to cultivate further.
Well, to continue on this, so as we're talking about the war in Ukraine, and obviously there are many aspects. I can have an entire afternoon with the both of you to discuss the war in Ukraine. We're also talking about transatlantic security, and obviously Dr. Grigas in terms of the energy factor within energy security. But there's also a country to Ukraine's north called Belarus, and obviously we've seen what's happened since 2020 in Belarus. There's a question that's been posed: what is the value of a free Belarus to the Western community, and is there any type of ideal scenario under which Belarus can break its ties with Russia? If we're discussing re-imperialization, obviously it's not just the imperialist state of what the Russian Federation is right now as an empire, but obviously what they're trying to do in Ukraine and what they've tried to do for the longest time in controlling Belarus. So maybe Dr. Grigas, if you'd like to answer that question.
I think unfortunately today Belarus is a captured state. I don't view it as an independent state in any sense as it is today. And under various, guises, Russia has gained control of it. Of course, with the pretext of, the cultural ties or, Russian-speaking population with various, corruption schemes. And, frankly, just, Lukashenko, who is today, pretty much under the thumb of the Kremlin. Because of the opposition movements since 2020. But, frankly, a lot of those opposition individuals, leaders, they are no longer if they're in Belarus, they're in jail or they have fled the country. The public has been, I think, just suffered tremendously. I mean, they faced tremendous brutality in the hands of the police, the secret services in Belarus. So I think they did, the public did what they could. They tried to have their kind of gut transition and revolution, but essentially it's been squashed. So I think today Belarus's future is very much tied to the future of, the Kremlin. And I think if we'll see, Russia defeated in this war in Ukraine, we'll see a free Belarus, or, much more likely to see a free Belarus. And then that's why we have the Belarusian volunteers, frankly, fighting in Ukraine, because of that very clear understanding that this is their fight, very much directly their fight as well.
Paul, anything you'd like to add?
I completely agree.
Okay, agree. Thank you. Again, when it comes to transatlantic, we know where France and we know where Germany have been, at least in the prior to February 24th of 2022, when it truly was trying to appease Moscow to the best of their abilities and leaving Ukraine out to dry, or frankly speaking, leaving Ukraine in the cold, literally. Last week, we know that Scholz visited Paris. We know that he met with Macron. There's a question, if you could talk about the differences in those two countries' defense and energy policies, especially as it refers to Russia right now and the war in Ukraine. Paul?
Yeah, so, boy, I mean,
These are
German
they're not easy questions that we have for
No,
you.
no, I mean, they're really good questions. They're important questions. I guess it's just, to be frank, I mean, there would be no full-scale invasion of Ukraine if not for Germany. I mean, Germany basically for 20 years has been pursuing a policy driven by Russian strategic corruption and co-option of German elites. Beginning with the co-option of Gerhard Schroeder while he was still in office, going through Merkel, going through Steinmeier, all the way up to Scholz. Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 are both products of corruption. The German economy was built to be reliant on Russia and then China, actually, also, because the notion was, Germany's economy is the only one in Europe that has maintained this middle manufacturing sector, because they sort of cheated, right? they were bringing in cheap gas, corrupt gas from Russia, and then they were building, and then they were selling to China. So they've effectively made themselves fully dependent on authoritarian regimes, and it's just like, it doesn't come as any surprise to anybody here, right? this is the fundamental problem, is we were pointing this out for like a decade. Just like, this is going to blow up in your face. It's going to blow up in your face. It's going to blow up in everybody's face, and then it did. And there's been almost no heads have rolled, no responsibility has been taken. Nothing is, it's just like, and even now there's hand wringing. Even now, Scholz is considering selling parts of Hamburg port to the Chinese and selling chip makers to the Chinese. It's like nothing has been learned. The French are no better, right? They have different strategic dependencies, and in some sense, they're more conscious of their dependencies. Like Germany's, I think, are significantly more part of elite capture and corruption, whereas I get the feeling that the French, like they kind of like the notion of counterbalancing, and here we'll sell a few arms to the Russians, and we'll sell just in case something happens. The French have always kind of had this notion of, well, America, we want to be the real military power, and maybe we should have this strategic autonomy and, kind of European army and kind of get NATO out of Europe and all that kind of stuff. So they've had kind of this we want to control the European military apparatus, whereas Germany, really made Europe strategically dependent on Russia. And without that strategic dependency, no way would Russia. I mean, after the original 2014 invasion, it's only after that Nord Stream 2 was built.
Absolutely.
It's just so has it gotten better? Not really. I think the Germans right now are, the Zeitenwende is not really real in the way that people wanted it to be. I mean, I think Schultz really overpromised, underdelivered. And I think the Germans are kind of deer in the headlights. I think they don't really know what to do. Their economic model is falling apart. I mean, it's falling apart no matter which way you go. I mean, unless somehow, there's those that want to go back to business as usual with Russia, but that's in reality, that's not going to happen because the Ukrainians simply are never going to let it happen. I mean, the Ukrainians aren't going to roll over now. I mean, it's, so it's just like, so Germany's in this space where it's hard for them to accept reality, which is that Russia's way weaker, is going to be isolated, is not what they thought it was, or what they dreamed it was, or what they were corrupted to believe it was, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, the sooner Germany confronts reality and kind of squares the circle and realizes that its place is with the democracies and not playing some Sonderweg, Mittellage, we're the country between the big countries. We're between America and Russia and China, and we counterbalance. The sooner Germany and France give up these notions of counterbalancing, which were always silly, and they were under different names, strategic autonomy, Mittellage, Sonderweg, all that kind of crap. The sooner all that's given up and they just say, we're on the side of democracy, the better off we all are, because that's where they are. I mean, the notion that they were ever going to really deeply align themselves with China was always silly, because China has no interest in individual rights. They have no interest in, allowing Europe to have its freedoms that it so enjoys, anyway.
Dr. Grigas, any
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with everything. And if you look at energy policy in particular, right before the invasion, literally in the early days of February, I was giving a talk, and it was, there were some on the energy policy in particular in Europe. And, I frankly called German energy policy impotent. And again, I received some flack for that. And, look, and of course, I would reiterate that word, probably the best word to describe it. If we look at Germany, Germany has been Russia's largest customer in Europe in terms of gas. I mean, #1 Gazprom customer. And the country that has announced that they're going to make this green transition and so on. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous that up until now, they did not build any LNG import terminals. They made no efforts to diversify. It's just nonsensical. I mean, frankly, nonsensical, and either complete impotence or just pure corruption can only explain their energy policy choices. And again, I can also share, I was in Germany speaking to energy executives there, and even the energy executives were saying, to build Nord Stream 2, that's just a political decision. It just makes no sense in the actual energy realities on the ground in Europe, and the transition, the hopes, the possibility. I mean, in any sense, it just doesn't make any sense. It's pretty much just a political decision. So, but I think another element here, I want to highlight that how long the Europeans and frankly, the Americans have taken it. This incredible level of corruption where so many top leaders, former prime ministers, chancellors, foreign ministers from, Germany, France, Austria, beyond, just after they are done with office, they go work for Russian state energy companies. I mean, there's a roster of them, and there have been no consequences for them whatsoever. And, I find that extraordinary that the European Union, NATO has, just openly watch this extraordinary level of corruption going on.
And I just, that's exactly, I just wanted to add real quick, because that's exactly right. And it's like a pyramid, right? I mean, what we see at the top, the tippy top, is just the very tip of the iceberg of the massive corruption. The further down you go, like, I mean, the German gas ministry, the foreign ministry, almost totally co-opted. I mean, to the point that all of them expect jobs in various Russian industries and lobbying shops and so on and so forth afterward. I mean, this has been the trend with the West. I mean, authoritarian states figured out you can just buy former officials, which means that when they are officials, they'll do what you say in the hopes of landing that lucrative job afterward.
So when it comes to Germany and France, obviously we know where they've been. We know about the corrupt officials that are working hand in hand with Russian corrupt officials as well. But who's really stepped up, at least in the past 8 months, if not even the past 8 years, are some of the Central and East European countries, neighbors of Ukraine, the Baltics, Poland, and so forth. There's a question that's been posed. Can you say a few words about their assistance to Ukraine? What has it meant for the Ukrainians on the battlefield? And frankly speaking, I think mostly, what has it meant for Ukraine's morale as well?
Mm-hmm. So I think the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they have stepped up and they have set precedents when the larger countries dallied and debated and couldn't, and feared to make a stance. And we've seen that consistently in every way, from, Lithuania, let's say, announcing that they will not buy any Russian gas immediately. And while a lot of the European powers still debated, is that feasible? Oh, that's not possible. That's unrealistic, and so on. Well, I don't know. It's realistic for Poland. It's realistic for Lithuania, countries that 10 years ago were 100% dependent on Russian gas. So how is that unrealistic for, countries who have maybe, let's say, a 30% dependency on Russian gas? How is it unrealistic for them to stop those purchases? We've seen it again from the weapons immediately. Not being afraid that this will be somehow a provocation or detrimental to relations with Russia and so on. So I think that has, and also political statements. I mean, calling Russia a terrorist state and so on. I think all of these have allowed to set that precedent, and then it allowed, I would say, the bigger countries to kind of think that over and follow suit. So I think it's been incredibly important, incredibly valuable, and they've truly been the vanguard in this fight against Russia. Because frankly, they know they're next. I mean, this is about, existential security for them. If Ukraine was to be overrun by Russia in, those 3 days or however, 3 months, whatever it would have been, I think that would have just only whet the appetite for the Kremlin.
So, Paul, to answer that, give you an opportunity to answer this question as well, but with a little bit of a pretext here. I personally followed your travels in Ukraine and Central Europe during the summertime. Every time I got onto Twitter, there was always a story from Paul Massaro, where he was, who he met with, and just the scope and the breadth of the individuals and officials that you met with. So maybe give us a little bit of perspective of your travels to the region, obviously to Ukraine and to Poland and to other countries, and how they've helped the war effort in Ukraine.
Yeah, so I guess I had this wonderful opportunity to travel Ukraine. And I went in twice, actually, and I met the extraordinary volunteers like Come Back Alive and Peril Charity Foundation and others, the Georgian Legion guys and others that are I mean the effort there is extraordinary. I mean, I don't think I need to tell anybody. I mean, Ukraine is totally determined to win this war. Every single individual, everyone's giving, you're either fighting or you're giving your last dime. In some way you are working to ensure that Ukraine will win the war. And I mean, you talk with Ukrainians and it's like absolutely fearless. It's kind of like, so what if Russia uses a nuclear weapon? And they're like, what of it? I mean, it's just really an incredible thing and an incredible commitment to freedom. I went I went on my own dime because, I mean, the United States is not currently allowing, any sort of official delegation beyond below a particular level. And of course, I'm, not a senator or representative or the president or anything like that. So in any case, I had the chance to meet a president, though. I actually got in with President Zelensky and was able to speak with him about, in fact, getting these Russian reserves and stuff like that. But I guess for me, February 24th is when we discovered what people are made of. And it's when the chips are down that you know who your real allies are. And I think it revealed after 30 years, who's going to stand with us when the worst happens, and who's going to stand for democracy, and who's going to put their all into fighting autocracy. And I mean, Ukraine, obviously, I mean, it's like, yeah, I want to talk about, but I mean, Ukraine itself is making the greatest sacrifice for the free world right now by a mile. I mean, there's no comparison. I don't think any country's made any similar sacrifice since World War II, probably. I mean, it's really extraordinary the extent to which Ukraine is giving all of its blood and all of its treasure to protect itself, of course, and its own independence and sovereignty and democracy. But I mean, everyone. I mean, they're defending everyone. Now, I have been blown away by the Polish and Baltic response in particular. I mean, the Czechs and Slovaks have been extraordinary as well. The Finns have been great. I mean, the Poles as leaders, though, especially given the size of the country. I mean, the Baltic states, obviously, it's wonderful. Like Latvia gave like 50% of its. I mean, all of them are like in half their military budgets going to Ukraine, basically. The comparable size makes it a little tougher, whereas like Poland is quite large, so I mean, giving all of your tanks and everything is just extraordinary. And just, I mean, Poland mobilized like Ukraine mobilized, like it's like, every single Pole is like, oh yeah, we got to defeat Russia, Ukraine's got to win the war, whereas then you get to Germany and it's like, well, I don't know, maybe we should talk about it. And I can't believe we can't talk to the Russians anymore and all that, it's so, but I mean, to me, the commitment shown by Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Finland, and I mean, the northern European states have also been Sweden, I mean, that's where I see the future of US alliances. And that's because, we should recognize that Russia is going to lose this war, and Russia will be isolated, and Russia, will face incredible internal difficulties that, lead to a transformation of Russia. I don't know what that's going to look like, but there's going to be some transformation of Russia. I hope it ends up in some form of freedom for the Russian people and the captive nations of Russia. But I mean, so much of that's going to be beyond our power fundamentally. But Russia, in many ways, will cease to be the threat it's been, because Russian capacity has been wildly reduced to cause problems all around the world. I mean, I often think like Syria, North Africa, Venezuela, China, Iran, like they're going to be so much less capable of screwing around with the whole world thanks to Ukraine, basically. So that's a wonderful thing for the world. But I mean, the long-term challenge is, of course, Chinese designs on Earth. And their vision of replacing a general international consensus toward human rights and democracy with a general international consensus toward authoritarianism and a surveillance state, which is their vision. And in that struggle, I believe that it's the Central and Eastern European states, minus Hungary, which, has been a really, really, really big problem for, some reason, but will play a major role in that struggle. And it's been really exciting, because it is, I think, what Dr. Griga said, that they're next, but it's also because the recent memory of totalitarian authoritarianism is there. Right. So every single one of these countries know what it means to actually live under authoritarianism. And nobody in the West knows that anymore. And the kids in the West are, I mean, some of them even flirt with authoritarianism now because, we got to defeat our political opponents and whatever else. And maybe authoritarianism wouldn't be so bad. Whereas nobody says that in that region. I mean, the Ukrainians, every Ukrainian my age is fighting and dying for their country in order not to live under authoritarianism. I cannot say the same about my generation here.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and there are quite a few questions. There are three in particular that I want to get to, but I want to follow up immediately on your comments about the Central and East European countries. It's not just in terms of the material assistance that they've given Ukraine, whether it's security assistance, weaponry, humanitarian assistance. It's also their political will, and their political will. I think we've seen in terms of their governments designating and recognizing Russia as a terrorist state, as a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, PACE also came out, the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. They also came out with their resolution. It was good. I think it was a little watered down, but it was a step in the right direction. Where do you see Washington in terms of this fundamental question of recognizing Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism? I know this has been the ongoing discussion for the past eight months at least. My community has been saying this for the longest time, even prior to that. But you have a terrorist state that's designated by the United States, that being the state of Iran, that's now supplying guided missiles and obviously drones to be used in Ukraine. So how do we equate that with Russia that's not designated as a state sponsor of terror? Paul, I'll start with you and then Dr. Rodriguez.
Sure. I mean, well, is there a more obvious terrorist state than Russia? I mean, you can even compare it to the other. I mean, Cuba's a terrorist state, right? I mean, like the, and rightfully so. But I mean, it's just unbelievable, looking at Russian actions and Russian terrorism and to not designate it. But I mean, this comes down to, I think, two considerations. One is, the U.S. designation would require and necessitate secondary sanctions, which would then likely hit various European companies, because of course Europe has not totally stopped business with Russia. I mean, some of the stuff's been stopped, but I mean, up until the bitter end, it wasn't the Europeans, it wasn't the Germans that stopped buying Russian gas. It was Russia that stopped selling it. I mean, and I mean, it was. To this day, German businesses are still active in Russia. I mean, they're still, I mean, it's, and because of that, there's this kind of this concern that this designation would possibly get in the way of this kind of transatlantic solidarity and this notion of like keeping the G7 together and all that kind of stuff to continue supporting Ukraine. And then the other, I mean, I don't buy these concerns, but I'm just explaining them. But then the other thing is, the designation of Russia as a terrorist state would effectively downgrade Russia from great power forever. I mean, and that's in some sense why the Ukrainians want it, and I get that, and I want it because of that reason too. I mean, but recognize that it's kind of what I was saying before about this notion of like this obsession with Russia as a great power, this obsession with talking to Moscow, all that kind of stuff, and whatever else. If you did this, you've effectively crossed the Rubicon into Russia is a rogue state. It is. Russia is a weak state. It is. Russia is nothing more than a Cuba, a North Korea, an Iran, and so on and so forth. Some place where the American goal is no longer engagement. It is no longer any sort of integration. It is purely isolation and capacity reduction. And in my opinion, it should be. Like, I think we're there, but a lot of people in this town are not there yet. Unfortunately.
Dr. Rodriguez?
No, I agree. And, it should be the case, but, will that political willpower be there? And then also maybe I would kind of touching on some of the other points we made also, how long will our memory be? And, frankly, Paul, you've said a number of times, everything changed post February 24th. Frankly, I mean, I would say, I hope. I don't know if truly everything changed post February 24th. Because we've had we've had 2014, we've had 2008. I mean, we've had a number of incidents here already. Well, incidents, a number of Russia's acts of aggression. I mean, we had the meddling in the the election. So we've had so many things happen, and then there are too many people, frankly, on a broad variety of sides who still hope to forget and somehow just move forward, just to return to business as usual. And I think part of it may be also because of some of the strains that we're also facing in the United States, economic, social, again, political divisions, and many other factors. So I think, you have to be strong domestically as well to take on this global geopolitical challenge. And that's another reality. How strong are we today in the United States as a society as well?
That's right. I guess
as an economy.
I want to point out that, American cleavages are American cleavages. They're homegrown, but our adversaries go to great lengths to exacerbate them.
Absolutely.
And this has been an incredibly effective divide and rule sort of strategy. And I mean, that's why we have bills right now, like the Enablers Act, which many people here know, that would finally put sort of due diligence obligations on US lawyers and accountants and so on and so forth, that many of your groups have supported, and thank you for that, and so on and so forth. And a huge part, and this is why I say, when we failed to fight kleptocracy and that led to this, we need to fight kleptocracy now. We need to get that blood money out of our system. We need to get the malign influence out of our system, because we can handle the cleavages if they're not being constantly exacerbated and they're not being constantly, blown up. Democracy can handle cleavage. We've had cleavage for since the beginning, but we can't handle it if there's all this money being thrown into turning those into insurmountable obstacles.
Lightning round, last two questions. I'll group them together. So with Russia's recent announcement of the break with the Ukrainian grain deal, it's on again, off again, it seems to be back on again. Do you think that this will affect the resolve of the EU and other countries to continue sanctions against Russia? And as we're speaking about Russia, what about internally in Russia? Is there any role for the Russian populace in any of these matters that are happening within Russia itself? So we'll start with the sanctions, with the grain deal, and then we'll go into Russia.
So I think, well, with the grain deal, you can't trust Russia in this regard, in any deal. Frankly, I think they're just buying time, and we're using this just as their own nefarious tactic. To what extent? Sorry, the second question?
Internally in Russia, what can the
internally in Russia, exactly.
In Russia,
I'm
Russian
pretty pessimistic, frankly, at also to how ready is Russian society to take on change, frankly. If we look at the polls, it's been 20 years of propaganda, 20 years of trying to evoke within the Russian populace this desire for Russia's greatness, rebuilding their empire, and so on. In fact, Putin has gone to war repeatedly, if you look at actually polls, when his popularity dipped. So he's launched military campaigns in order to boost his popularity. That's very telling in itself, and it worked for him every single time. I think maybe this time he really took it too far because, frankly, the country's, I think, just falling apart and just can't handle this scale of a war. But again, we've seen, the Russians that have decided to flee that rather than try to, seek change in the country. So, I don't know. I'm rather honestly pretty pessimistic for the near term.
Paul?
I completely agree with the answer to the first question. So you can't trust Russia as far as you can throw them. It's kind of irrelevant. The only thing you can do is defeat Russia in the field, and that's what you're gonna do. The best way to negotiate with Russia is with HIMARS. The second thing is I also am extremely pessimistic. I really do think that, again, Russia will just need to be totally defeated in Ukraine and totally pushed back. And even then, who knows how long Putin's around? I don't really anticipate, Putin being taken down by anything really, except one day old age, who knows, but I also don't think we need to necessarily focus on that. I think we can develop a new policy over here based on as we discussed, decolonial perspectives and listening to, Central and Eastern Europeans and getting away from this. And really what we can control, we should focus on what we can control. And what we can control is arming Ukrainians, sanctioning Russia, and getting our head straight on what Russia is and what Russia isn't, and then move on from there and not try to necessarily do all too much to impact what is going to happen in Russia and what is not. I mean, in my mind, Russia's effectively a North Korea style state now. I mean, the best thing we can do is isolate and focus on what we can control, but really isolate, not no integration, and we can control that. We can decide, and it's our sovereign decision to decide, our sovereign decisions to decide who we trade with and who has access to our financial system. This is for us to decide, and we can make a decision that dictators don't get that.
Fantastic discussion. I don't know how to thank our panelists for truly an enlightening discussion. You've given us so much food for thought and a lot of good homework to do as well, as there are many good initiatives here in Washington, D.C. So I would like to thank also the audience members for your participation, for your questions. It was definitely a very thought-provoking discussion. And a big thank you to my colleagues at the Central and East European Coalition, the ones in front of the camera, behind the camera, Veronica, Clara, Vitas, Carl, research assistants. Hopefully I didn't forget anyone. Thank you. Dr. Grigas, Paul, thank you very much. I don't know how to thank you because this was A, very timely, and B, we are 6 days away from our midterm elections. So a lot will depend upon what happens come January when a new Congress comes into session, and obviously what happens on the battlefield in Ukraine as well. So there's a lot to discuss yet, and I hope that we can have you back for future type of forum discussion. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you all at the next CEC policy briefing session. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Michael.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.